There is something they aren't telling us about the war in Ukraine. Something that explains the tremendous shift that is taking place in MAGA circles. A sudden change of direction that involves wanting to support Kyiv with more intelligence, more weapons, more missiles. There's even talks of giving them the formidable Tomahawks. Why? Well, that's exactly what we're going to look at on VisualPolitik today. And I can tell you in advance, there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye. There's good news and bad news. It seems that Donald Trump has slammed on the brakes and made a 180-degree turn in his rhetoric and his approach to the war in Ukraine. At least, that's what we're seeing right now. From cozying up to Vladimir Putin, to saying that Russia is a paper tiger, a second-rate threat, and even that Ukraine has the capacity to recover all its occupied territory. I'm sure that the vast majority of you have already seen this message.
I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, a war that should have taken a real military power less than a week to win. This is not distinguishing Russia. In fact, it is very much making them look like a paper tiger. Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act.
And that's not all. As we'll see in this same video, the White House is even considering drastically increasing military aid to Zelensky's country. Yeah, with everything he's been saying. But be careful. Knowing Trump, it's only a matter of time before we see new and unexpected twists again. What's more, and this is important, there's also a second interpretation of the facts. Trump is not saying in his messages that the United States has to throw its weight behind Ukraine. What he's repeating is something different, that Kyiv must resist, with the support of Europe, not directly with that of Washington. And we only need to go back to the Truth Social message we saw a moment ago where Trump made this very clear. Take a look.
I wish both countries well. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them. Good luck to all!
In other words, Uncle Sam would simply sell weapons to Ukraine through orders and the pockets of European governments. In this way, the war would basically become big business for the United States. Thanks to it, they would be supplying the old continent with large quantities of weapons and also natural gas. But let's see, it wouldn't be fair not to mention that practically all sources affirm that, indeed, a kind of seismic shift has taken place in the White House. Support for Ukraine is now much higher, and as we shall see, this is already translating into concrete actions. And so the question is, what the hell happened? What explains the fact that after berating Zelensky right in the Oval Office, the White House is now considering a complete reversal of its position over the years? Well, it's very simple. Basically, we have two main reasons. The first is widely known. His rapprochement with Putin has been a complete disaster. Trump has flattered him, fawned over him. He even described him as a man of peace and rolled out the red carpet for him in the United States. It was like a Sweet 16 party in which Putin had his return to the international podium within reach. However, Vladimir Putin hasn't given an inch. He has conceded absolutely nothing. He hasn't even made the slightest gesture of courtesy. All of Washington's requests have been rejected by Moscow. Let's remember that Trump's confidence was so sky high that he was even caught telling Macron that he believed Putin would end the war for him, for Donald Trump as a personal gesture. But no, nothing close. No ceasefire, no more provocations on NATO's Eastern Front, no end to the bombing of civilian targets, no meetings between Putin and Zelensky, nothing at all. But okay, I think we all know this already. The point is that I mentioned earlier that there's a second reason, and that is that, in the meantime, the war rages on, with all that that implies. Take a look.
Russian missile upgrade outpaces Ukraine's Patriot defenses. Kyiv's interception rates fall as enemy strikes dodge U.S. interceptors in final seconds.
Pay attention to this news. In recent months, Russian missile attacks have been much more successful. And what does that mean? Well, it means that Moscow seems to have managed to alter its missiles, including the Iskander and Kinyal, to overcome Ukrainian defenses. The trick? Apparently, software changes. With these changes, the Russians have made their missiles follow a typical flight path, and then, at the very end, execute unpredictable maneuvers to confuse Ukraine's anti-aircraft interceptors. Among them, as we saw a moment ago, the Patriot system manufactured by the American companies Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. The result? Many more strategic targets hit and destroyed. For instance, Ukraine's leading drone factories have suffered greatly in the last 2 months, and things are getting worse. Because we have to add to this the growing lack of anti anti-aircraft defenses available to the Ukrainians. The consequence? The interception rate of ballistic missiles launched by Russia plummeted to 6% in September. Note that this is not according to data from Moscow, but from the Ukrainian Air Force itself. To make matters worse, Russia is also managing to attack Ukraine's own air defense systems. This has resulted in many more casualties among highly skilled technicians, who are in short supply. For example, last December, Lieutenant Colonel Denis Sakhan, chief engineer of an anti-aircraft missile unit in the 96th Brigade in Kyiv, was killed. He was one of the first Ukrainians to master the Patriot system, and one of the architects who made it possible for the American system to shoot down an entire Kinyal KH-47M2. In other words, a hypersonic ballistic missile. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of Russian missiles. Well, put it all together, and you'll understand that Ukraine has a problem, especially now that winter is approaching. Because, as you know, there's nothing Moscow likes more than attacking all kinds of civilian infrastructure, such as power plants, just when the cold weather arrives. What's the objective? Logically, to punish the Ukrainian population for resisting, and, in passing, to try to make them give up their fight. This is something they've been doing since the war began. But if the air defenses fail now, well, it stands to reason that the result could be very bad. In fact, in recent days, we've already seen news stories like this one.
Russian missiles and drones pound Ukraine in savage 12-hour attack. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says assault involved nearly 500 drones and more than 40 missiles.
But, okay, I know the question that I'm sure has crossed more than one of your minds. Come on, Josh, this is the typical tug of war we've been seeing since practically the beginning of the war. Why on earth would Donald Trump be concerned about it now? Well, for two reasons. First, because, yes, it's true, Russia is advancing slowly, very, very slowly on the battlefield, and it's doing so at immense cost, both in terms of casualties and in terms of an economy that's already struggling. But of course, things in Ukraine are not any better, and after months of meager military support from Washington, their situation has deteriorated considerably. And if Russia's missile advantage continues to increase, who knows what could happen? Because, on top of everything, there's always an unpredictable component in any war. And let's see, clearly, the Ukrainians have not been sitting idly by. Their military industry is also developing equipment at full speed. The Sting quadcopter, for example, is one of their latest hits. This is a very cheap drone killer that is allowing them to save a lot of anti-aircraft defense interceptors. But, let me stress, the truth is that there are significant cracks, and Trump clearly does not want to go down in history as the guy who came promising the end of the war and ended up causing Ukraine's defeat. That would be a huge blow to his public image, as well as a colossal strategic disaster. It's a scenario that Washington doesn't even want to imagine. That's why more and more voices, even within the MAGA circle itself, are calling on the president to start making moves. And then the second reason is that there are clear suspicions that China is not only watching and learning from everything that is happening in Ukraine, but could even be collaborating with Russia to overcome Western weaponry. In other words, for Beijing, this war could become a great testing ground. Well, these two reasons are precisely what lies behind news stories such as this one.
U.S. to provide intel to guide Ukrainian long-range missile attacks on Russia.
Indeed, the United States has decided to give Ukraine more intelligence information to help guide its long-range attacks, whether with missiles or drones, and these will be directed, in particular, against Russia's energy infrastructure. And that's not all. Washington is also asking other NATO members to do the same, and Keith Kellogg, Trump's special envoy, has confirmed that the president has authorized Ukraine to use high-level American weapons, such as ATACMS, to destroy targets inside Russia.
This is where I think the Ukrainians have an opportunity to challenge Russia much more aggressively.
But hold on a minute, because there is a catch. What is it? Well, Ukraine's remaining stocks are very limited. Therefore, the key lies above all in whether or not news such as this is confirmed.
Vance says, U.S. considering Tomahawk missiles for Ukraine.
Let's see. Here, I'm taking a leap of faith. It's unlikely that these missiles will end up in the hands of Zelensky's troops. These missiles cost a fortune, more than $1.3 million apiece. Production capacity is limited, and the US arsenals are not exactly overflowing, not to mention how Russia might respond. And that brings us to talk about the Barracudas. These are very new American cruise missiles. They cost almost a tenth of the price of Tomahawks, and can accurately hit targets almost 1,000 kilometers away. However, they fly at subsonic speeds, which makes them more vulnerable, and they can carry smaller warheads. But even so, it would be a big step forward. Of course, to be fair, we don't know how long this apparent shift by Donald Trump will last. He's a president who tends to look toward Moscow, but it doesn't matter, because the fact that the matter is under discussion is very significant in itself. Do you know why? Because long-range strikes may be the best way to change the course of the war. Why do I say this? Because of something Ukraine is already doing, constantly hammering Russia's energy infrastructure. Pay attention to what we're about to tell you, because we've already told you that the Ukrainians haven't been sitting idly by. Listen up.
Putin's oxygen.
VisualPolitik community, let me stress that the Ukrainians have not stood idly by. In fact, in recent months, we've seen how almost all the red lines that existed have been disappearing. The most important of all, without a doubt, this one.
Ukraine is stepping up attacks on Russian energy, and it's working.
Now, Ukraine attacking Russian refineries is nothing new. What is new is the pace and intensity with which they are doing so right now. Take a look at this figure. Since August alone, 16 of Russia's 38 refineries have been hit. And what happens when a refinery is destroyed? Simple. Either you reduce production to a minimum, or you shut it down altogether. And this is something that is starting to hurt Moscow a lot. And yes, it's true that Russia has modernized its missiles, is churning out drones like crazy, and is increasingly mastering Ukraine's air defense systems. But as you can see, Ukraine also has reasons to brag. For example, at the end of September, a swarm of Ukrainian drones traveled 1,400 kilometers and struck a Gazprom refinery and petrochemical plant in this tongue twister of a region you see on screen, located in central Russia. They've also recently struck important plants, such as the Ryazan refinery, which has a capacity to produce 340,000 barrels of diesel per day. And take note, because diesel isn't just another fuel here, it plays a key role and has therefore become the main target of Ukrainian attacks. But why this obsession with diesel? Basically, because Russia is still the world's second largest exporter of this fuel, to the point that it's one of the fundamental pillars on which its economy is based, and with which it finances the war. And here you have to take one thing into account. Refineries are crucial for two reasons. First, because they're essential to keeping the Russian economy going. And second, because they allow the export of products with a higher margin than simple crude oil. Let's face it, it's no secret that selling diesel or gasoline is much more lucrative than simply selling unrefined barrels. But the question is, to what extent are the Ukrainian attacks already affecting Russia? Well, check out this news article and judge for yourselves.
Russia extends gasoline export ban till end of 2025.
Indeed, things are so bad that Russia, one of the world's oil giants, has had to ban gasoline exports. Yes, you heard correctly. The country that boasted of selling energy by the bucketful can no longer guarantee its own supply. Specifically, it's estimated that Russia is currently facing a deficit of around 20% of gasoline demand. This is something that consumers are already beginning to notice. For example, 1 in 50 gas stations has stopped selling gasoline, and in many regions, there are huge lines to fill up cars. Even in occupied Crimea and certain parts of Siberia, rationing has had to be introduced. And not surprisingly, in the locations where gasoline is available, it's much more expensive. Take note of this fact. Russian wholesale prices for 95-octane gasoline have skyrocketed 45% so far in 2025 alone. And this is despite the fact that crude oil prices have fallen. Well, now, after gasoline, it's diesel's turn. You see, according to data from the end of September, Ukrainian attacks in recent weeks have targeted the plants that refine this fuel. The result? Russian diesel production has fallen to its lowest level since 2020, that is, since the pandemic lockdowns. In numbers, the drop is equivalent to more than 1 million barrels per day of refined fuel that have simply disappeared from the market. And if Ukraine keeps up the pace of attacks, Russian diesel exports will fall to lows not seen in more than half a decade. This is already driving up prices on international markets. In other words, Kyiv is dealing Moscow a severe blow. The result? In Russia, the situation with diesel is beginning to follow the same path as that of gasoline. And you know what that means.
Russia declares partial diesel export ban until year-end. extends gasoline ban.
Let me say it again, this is a serious blow. And some will say, okay, but is it enough to really worry Moscow? Well, we don't need to say anything. The numbers speak for themselves. About a third of the Russian state's revenue depends directly on oil and fuel exports. And this year, that revenue is plummeting. In September alone, exports of refined products fell by 10% compared to August. And this has not been an isolated incident. There have been several consecutive months of negative figures, one after another. Seen in this light, it certainly sounds different. And remember what we were saying a moment ago regarding long-range attacks? It makes sense that if the Ukrainians have more intelligence data, more capacity to map Russian defenses, and more means to carry out more numerous and more precise attacks, Russia's problem will become even greater. That is exactly what is at stake, and that is probably why they've convinced Trump that there are more alternatives than simply surrendering if Putin does not give in. In fact, take a look at what Trump was boasting about earlier this year.
We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure.
However, things are now radically different. Look.
The U.S. will provide Ukraine with intelligence for long-range missile strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure, American officials said, as the Trump administration weighs sending Kyiv powerful weapons that could put in range more targets within Russia.
The reason? Everything we've already told you in this video. Remember, the enormous frustration with Putin, who has made no concessions, and the cracks within Ukraine itself. VisualPolitik community, this is how things stand and how the war and Washington's position have changed. The question now is, how far will this White House's support for Ukraine go? Will Trump's sudden change of direction be permanent? Or will we soon see him cozying up to Russia again? How do you think this whole story will unfold? Leave your thoughts in the comments and let's kick off the debate. But first, if you like this video, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you so very much for being there. All the best. See you soon.